Hello and welcome to the Mini Book Podcast, African American Books Edition.
It's great to be here.
I'm your host, and today we are talking about a truly essential piece of history. We're looking at calling out liberty, the Stono Slave Rebellion, and the universal struggle for human rights.
Which is by the author Jack Shuler.
That's right.
And it is a really incredible examination of an event that, quite frankly, doesn't get nearly enough attention in the standard history books.
Absolutely not. Now, before we really get into it, I do want to take a quick moment to thank you for listening.
Yes, thank you all for tuning in.
And if you enjoy what you hear today, please consider subscribing for future content. We also want to state this clearly right up front. After hearing this podcast, we encourage you to go out and purchase this book and support the author, Jack Shuler.
Yes, supporting these authors is just crucial. And, a quick disclaimer for everyone listening in. The voices you are hearing right now are generated by AI.
Right.
But the content, the history, the analysis, all the facts, they come straight from the book.
And we really feel that this is a great way to learn about African American history.
It really is. It makes it accessible.
Exactly. So let's get into it. We are traveling back in time today.
Way back.
All the way back to South Carolina. But not the South Carolina you might be thinking of for a vacation. We're going to September 9th, 1739.
A Sunday morning of all times.
Right, a Sunday morning. And I want you to just picture this scene for a second. There's a group of men marching south.
And they are not hiding.
No, not at all. They aren't sneaking through the woods in the middle of the night. They are marching right down the road, beating drums, carrying banners.
And shouting. It's a scene that just completely upends that traditional narrative of what we think escape looked like under slavery.
It really does.
I mean, this was not just an escape. This was a declaration.
And that brings us right to the central argument of Jack Shuler's book. He argues that this rebellion, the Stono Rebellion, wasn't just a physical fight. He calls it a literary act.
Which is such a fascinating way to frame it, isn't it?
It is.
Because when we hear literary, we think of, books, pens, paper. But what Shuler is saying is that these enslaved people were participating in the global debate about human rights.
The same debate that guys like John Locke or Thomas Jefferson were having.
Exactly. But they were doing it with their actions. They were, in a way, writing their own Declaration of Independence, just not with ink.
I love that concept, writing with movement, with drums. But okay, before we get to the marching, we have to understand the world they were in.
We have to set the stage.
Shuler describes South Carolina in the 1730s as, well, essentially a powder keg.
A disaster waiting to happen.
Yeah.
That is the feeling you get page after page. And you have to look at the demographics to really get the tension. It was a black majority colony.
Which means there were more enslaved people than white colonists.
Significantly more. I mean, we are talking about roughly 40,000 enslaved people versus, maybe 20,000 white inhabitants?
Wow, 2 to 1.
And in some local areas, some parishes, the ratio is even more extreme, sometimes 10 to 1. So you can imagine the white population lived in this constant low-level, sometimes high-level state of pure anxiety.
They knew they were outnumbered.
They knew. And the conditions themselves, Shuler describes the environment as just brutal. It wasn't just social tension. The physical landscape itself was deadly.
In what way?
It was a graveyard, really. You had malaria, smallpox, yellow fever, just tearing through the population. It was a deadly place to live for everyone, but especially for the enslaved who were forced into this back-breaking labor of rice cultivation.
Standing in swamps all day.
They were literally terraforming the landscape, clearing swamps, building dikes, standing in stagnant water under that punishing sun.
And Shuler mentions this term for when new captives arrive that it sends a shiver down your spine. Seasoning.
Yeah. Such a clinical, awful term for a horrific process. When the slave ships arrived from Africa, they would anchor at Sullivan's Island, right at the entrance to Charleston Harbor.
Like a quarantine station.
Exactly. The seasoning was this period where they would just wait. They waited to see who would survive the new diseases, the shock of the environment, before they could be sold. It was a breaking-in period, both physically and psychologically.
So you survive the Middle Passage, this horrific journey, only to be stuck on an island to see if you die of fever before you're sold into bondage.
That's it. It was designed to strip away identity and, weed out the physically weak. But, as we're about to see, it didn't strip away their culture.
Or their military training.
Not at all.
So you have this brutal place, this population disparity, and then you have the philosophy of the time. This is where it gets really, really interesting to me. We've all heard of John Locke.
Of course. The father of liberalism.
The guy who wrote about life, liberty, and property. His ideas basically fueled the American Revolution.
They did, but Schuller points out this massive, massive irony.
The ultimate irony. John Locke, the philosopher of liberty, he actually helped write what was it, the fundamental constitutions of Carolina?
That's the one, back in the late 1600s. And that document explicitly codified slavery. It gave every free man absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves.
How do you even reconcile that? All people have natural rights, but also I have absolute power over you. It seems like such a glaring contradiction.
It is, and it isn't. It all depends on how they defined human and rights at the time. To get it, we really need to break down two complex terms here: natural rights versus civil rights.
Oh, wait, let's unpack that. What's the difference?
So, natural rights are the rights you have just by virtue of being a human being. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. These supposedly come from God or from nature, not from any government.
They're innate.
Right. Civil rights, on the other hand, are rights that are given to you by a government because you're a citizen of that state.
So natural rights are universal, civil rights are granted by law.
Correct. And the tension, the hypocrisy of the Enlightenment was that Europeans were talking all about freedom as a natural right for themselves. But for Africans, they created a kind of legal loophole.
How so?
They basically argued that because Africans weren't part of their civil society, not part of the social contract of Europe, the government could strip them of those natural rights. Essentially, their law could override nature.
So in their minds, slavery was legally justified, even if it totally contradicted the natural idea of freedom. They literally legislated away their humanity.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And Schuller's whole point is that the Stono rebels weren't just reacting to, bad treatment. They were fundamentally challenging that distinction. They were asserting their natural rights in the face of a system that denied they had any to begin with.
Now, besides the philosophy, there was also a very real geopolitical chess game going on that set the stage for all this.
Oh, absolutely.
We have the British in South Carolina, but just to the south you have
The Spanish. And this is crucial. Spain controlled Florida, and they were the bitter rivals of the British. They looked at that black majority in South Carolina not just as a British economic asset, but as a strategic weakness.
of vulnerability.
Yeah.
So they decided to poke the bear.
Exactly. The Spanish king issued an edict. And this edict said that any enslaved person who could escape British territory and make it to St. Augustine, Florida, would be granted their freedom.
That's a huge incentive.
A massive one. There were conditions, of course. You had to convert to Catholicism and serve the Spanish crown.
Still, get to Florida, get freedom. That is a powerful signal to send north into those rice fields.
And it wasn't just some vague promise. There was a real place. It was called Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, or just Fort Mose for short.
What was Fort Mose?
It was a town established specifically for escaped slaves just north of St. Augustine. It was actually the first free black settlement in what is now the United States.
So for the people toiling away in South Carolina, Fort Mose was the promised land. It was real.
It was. And the Stono rebels, they knew about it. This wasn't a blind march into the unknown. They were heading for a specific destination. They knew a sanctuary was waiting for them if they could just fight their way there.
Which brings us to the rebels themselves. Who were these men? Because Schuller is very specific about this. He doesn't just call them Africans.
No, and that specificity completely changes the story. Schuller, and he's citing historians like John Thornton here, identifies them specifically as Congolese, or Anglans as the term was used then.
Why does that distinction matter so much? Why is it important where exactly they came from?
Because the Kingdom of Congo was a very specific cultural and political world. For one thing, it had been interacting with the Portuguese for a very long time. Many of the people from that region were already Catholic.
Ah, so the Spanish requirement to convert to Catholicism wasn't a hurdle.
Not at all. They might have already considered themselves Catholic. But even more importantly, and this is probably the key factor in why Stono happened the way it did, many of these men were likely former soldiers.
Soldiers.
Yes, the Kingdom of Congo had been just ravaged by civil wars. The people who were captured and sold into the slave trade, they weren't just, farmers or villagers. Many were prisoners of war.
You're veterans.
Veterans. They knew how to use guns. They knew how to fight in formation. They understood military discipline and hierarchy.
That changes everything. You're not dealing with a disorganized mob of desperate people. You're dealing with what is essentially a captured military unit.
That's it, exactly. And they probably spoke Portuguese, or at least a pidgin trade language, which allowed them to communicate across different ethnic lines and maybe even understand some of the talk between the British and the Spanish.
And Schuller introduces us to the leader of this group, a man named Jemmy.
sometimes called Cato.
Right. What do we know about him?
Well, the historical record is pretty sparse, but what we can infer is powerful. He was clearly charismatic, he was literate, and we should probably break down what literacy means in this context.
Yeah, that's a good point. When we say literate today, we mean reading and writing text.
Right, and Jimmy might have been able to do that, maybe in Portuguese or even Arabic. But literacy here also means the ability to read the world around you.
To read the situation.
Exactly. He could read the political landscape, he understood the tension between Britain and Spain, he understood the geography, and he had the ability to organize and communicate a very complex plan to a large group of people right under the noses of their enslavers. That is a profound kind of literacy.
So we have the setting a powder keg. We have the actors, these Congolese soldiers led by a brilliant strategist. Now let's go to that day, September 9th, 1739. Why then? Why a Sunday?
The timing was, impeccable. First, as you said, it's Sunday. In the Anglican tradition of the colonists, Sunday was a day of rest. Supervision was lower. But there was a specific spark,
What was it?
a new law. The Security Act of 1739. It had just been proposed, and it was going to require all white men to carry their guns with them to church.
To prevent exactly this kind of thing from happening.
Precisely. But that law wasn't set to take effect until September 29th. So the rebels realized they had this closing window of opportunity,
They knew the white men would be unarmed at church on the 9th.
but would be armed a few weeks later. It's incredible foresight. Plus, Charleston was distracted by a massive yellow fever epidemic. It was the perfect storm.
So the rebellion begins at a place called Stono Bridge. They strike Hutchinson's store.
Yes. They raid the store for weapons, guns, powder, ammunition. They kill the two storekeepers. And then they do something that Schuler points out is extremely significant, symbolic even.
What's that?
They leave the storekeepers' heads on the front steps.
That is gruesome. But Schuler argues it wasn't just random, brutal violence.
No, it was a message. It was a communication. Schuler analyzes this through the lens of power. Placing heads on pikes, displaying bodies. That was exactly what the white colonial government did to rebels or criminals.
It was a terror tactic used by the state.
The rebels were turning that language of power right back against the slaveholders. They were saying, we can use your tactics. We are a power to be reckoned with.
From there, they start moving south, toward Florida. And it's interesting, this wasn't just a rampage where they killed every white person in sight, was it?
Not entirely. They certainly burned plantations and killed many slaveholders who got in their way. But there's this famous account of a tavern keeper named Wallace. They spared him
Why?
because he was known to be kind to his slaves. This shows remarkable discipline and a kind of moral judgment. This wasn't blind rage. It was a calculated war against a specific system and the people who upheld it most brutally.
And as they marched, their numbers grew.
I did.
And this is the image that really sticks with me. Schuler says they marched with colors flying.
Yes. Eyewitness accounts, including one from General Oglethorpe of Georgia, describe them marching with banners, probably made of white cloth and drums beating. And they were shouting something.
Liberty.
Liberty. And this is where Schuler's thesis really hits home. They weren't shouting revenge or war. They were shouting liberty. This is the same word that was bubbling up in the coffee houses of London, the salons of Paris.
It's the same concept that white colonists would use to justify their own rebellion against Britain just a few decades later.
Exactly. Schuler argues they were invoking that universal human right. They were claiming it for themselves.
It's incredible to think about. A group of African men in the Deep South marching under a banner of liberty in 1739, but then a chance encounter changes everything.
It's just pure historical coincidence. As they're marching, they literally run into the Lieutenant Governor of South Carolina, William Bull.
The lieutenant governor.
On horseback, riding with a few companions. He sees them, he instantly realizes what is happening, and he flees for his life.
And because he escapes, he's able to raise the alarm.
Exactly. That's the turning point. If they had captured Bull, who knows how far they could have gotten. But Bull rides hard, he rallies the militia, and the clock starts ticking for the rebels.
This leads to the final confrontation. The rebels stop in an open field near the Edisto River, and this is a part of the story that has been completely misinterpreted for centuries.
Massively misinterpreted. White accounts from the time and for a long time after claim the rebels stopped because they were drunk and disorderly.
The story was they raided a tavern, got drunk, and started partying.
Right. But Schuler, again leaning on the work of John Thornton, argues that is a complete, total misreading of the culture.
So what were they actually doing?
They were performing assangmento.
Assangimento. Can you break that down?
Yeah, it's a Congolese ritual. It's a war dance, a
Yeah.
declaration of battle. They weren't partying, they were rallying. They were spiritually and physically preparing for the fight they knew was coming.
So the drumming wasn't for dancing.
The drumming was a communication tool. It was a call to arms for other enslaved people in the area to join them, and it was a spiritual preparation for war.
That completely flips the script. It transforms them from irresponsible rioters into disciplined soldiers preparing for a last stand.
And when the militia finally arrived, the rebels fought like a disciplined company. They used flanking maneuvers, they fired in volleys, they fought with the skill of veterans.
But in the end, they were outnumbered.
Eventually, yes. The militia was better armed, and by that afternoon had the element of surprise on their side. Many rebels were killed in the fighting. Many more were executed later. Jemmy, the leader, died fighting.
For the right.
As one account puts it, he fought for the right.
Now, Schiller talks about something he calls the uncanny network. What does he mean by that?
It's a fascinating concept. He's basically asking, how did they organize this? They didn't have text messages or phones. They were under constant surveillance. The uncanny network refers to all the subterranean ways that information traveled among the enslaved.
Like the grapevine telegraph.
Yes, but more sophisticated than that. Drums, as we mentioned, can literally talk. They can mimic the tonal patterns of speech in some African languages.
And songs, too.
Songs with hidden meanings. There's even theories about patterns in quilts that might have signaled safe houses or escape routes. Schuller argues the entire rebellion was a massive communication event. They were broadcasting their desire for freedom using a network the white slaveholders didn't even know existed, or at least couldn't understand.
So the rebellion is crushed. But the impact, the psychological impact was massive. How did the white colonists react?
Fear. Absolute, shaking fear. They had a terrifying realization that their property was human, intelligent, organized, and capable of sophisticated military action.
So the reaction was swift and harsh.
Incredibly so. They passed the Negro Act of 1740.
The big crackdown.
It was a comprehensive legal code designed to lock down every single aspect of black life. And if you look at what they chose to ban, it tells you exactly what they were afraid of.
What were some of the prohibitions?
First, they banned drums.
Because they finally realized it was a communication tool.
They recognized the drum as a weapon of war. They also banned literacy. No more teaching enslaved people to read or write. They wanted to cut off their access to information, to maps, to news, even to the Bible on their own terms.
And they even restricted what people could wear.
Yes, the law dictated the quality of fabrics enslaved people could wear. This was about humiliation. It was about visually enforcing a lower status every single day.
Schuller argues the real goal of this law was dehumanization.
That is the absolute core of it. They wanted to turn these captive soldiers, which is what they now knew they were, into chattel.
We should define that term, chattel slavery. We hear it a lot, but what does it really mean?
Chattel is related to the word cattle. It means movable property.
Yeah.
The whole point of the Negro Act was to legally strip away every shred of humanity, their culture, their language, their ability to move, their agency, until the law viewed them solely as property, like a plow or a cow.
A psychological war waged through legislation.
That's a perfect way to put it.
But, and here is the incredible part of the story, Fernie. Despite this massive effort to erase their humanity and erase the memory of what they did, the story survived.
It did. But it had to survive a war over memory. And Schiller introduces us to a key figure in that war.
Yeah.
A 19th century historian and novelist named William Gilmore Simms.
The guy who tried to rewrite the history.
Exactly. Simms was a prominent South Carolinian, very pro-slavery. He wrote about Stono, but he completely distorted the narrative.
Yeah.
In his version, the rebels are just drunkards. They're foolish, easily manipulated by the Spanish. He strips them of all their agency, their intelligence, their military skill.
He wanted to make them look like children who needed masters to control them.
That's the pro-slavery argument in a nutshell. And his version, the Simms version, was the one taught in South Carolina schools for decades, well into the 20th century. It was an intentional erasure of the truth.
But the truth has a way of sticking around, doesn't it? And this is where we meet a man named George Cato.
This is one of the most moving parts of the book. In 1937, during the Great Depression, the government's Works Progress Administration sent writers out to interview former slaves and their descendants.
The WPA interviews.
Right. And one of the people they interviewed was a man named George Cato.
And who was he?
He was the great-great-grandson of the rebel leader, Jemmy, who is also known in his family as Cato.
Wow. So the real story had been passed down in that family for nearly 200 years.
underground, secretly, through oral tradition, despite the bans on literacy, despite all the suppression. And George Cato tells a completely different story than William Gilmore
What
Simms.
does George Cato say?
He describes his ancestor not as a drunk rioter, but as a man of principle. He actually quotes his ancestor saying, "We don't like slavery. We are not converted."
We are not converted. That is so powerful.
And he says his ancestor was willing to lay down his life for the right. George Cato's account framed the rebellion as a conscious political choice. It preserved the dignity and the heroism of the rebels against centuries of propaganda.
It just shows the incredible power of oral history, doesn't it? The official books were lying, but the families, they knew the truth.
They kept the truth alive.
So bringing this all together, what is the legacy of Stono? Schuler really connects this event to the bigger picture of American history.
He absolutely does. He connects the dots from Stono in 1739 all the way to the American Revolution in 1776. I mean, think about it. The Stono rebels were demanding liberty almost 40 years before Jefferson wrote it in the Declaration of Independence.
They were fighting for the exact same concepts.
It's almost like Stono was the prologue to the revolution.
Or maybe the first chapter that got ripped out of the book.
That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
And Schuler traces that line even further to the slave rebellions of the 19th century, like Denmark Vesey's and Nat Turner's. The fear of another Stono literally haunted the white South for generations.
And he even connects it to the civil rights movement of the 1960s.
Yes, the right to communicate, the right to assemble, these were the rights that were suppressed by the Negro Act of 1740. And they were the same rights that Martin Luther King Jr. was fighting for 2 centuries later.
So what does this tell us about the idea of human rights itself? I mean, usually we think of them as something written down in the Geneva Convention or in a constitution.
That's the key takeaway from the book, I think. Schuler is arguing that human rights aren't just things written down by wealthy men in wigs in secure rooms.
Right.
Human rights are forged in the fire of struggle. They are defined by the very people who were denied them. When the Stono rebels marched and died for liberty, they were defining what freedom means just as much as John Locke or Thomas Jefferson ever did.
It provides a powerful counter-narrative.
Exactly. It counters that old, damaging idea that enslaved people were just passive recipients of history. It shows they were active agents. They were thinkers, planners, fighters. They shaped the world we live in.
And there's finally a historical marker at the site of the rebellion now, right?
Yes, at the site of Hutchinson's store. And it specifically acknowledges the rebels' cry of liberty. It took a very long time, but the landscape itself is finally starting to tell the truth.
To close out, Schuler uses this beautiful metaphor from the Gullah language to describe the ongoing march for freedom. Day clean.
Day clean. It means the dawn, the new day. And the idea is that the work of Stono that marched toward true liberty, it isn't over. We are all still moving toward that day clean, that full realization of human rights for everyone.
That is a beautiful and powerful image to hold on to.
It really is. It reminds us that history isn't just about what happened back then. It's about what is still happening right now.
Well, we have covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from the rice fields of 1739 to Enlightenment philosophy to the oral histories of the 1930s.
It's a dense, powerful story.
And Schuler tells it so well.
So to summarize, the Stono Rebellion wasn't just a riot, it was a revolution. It was a sophisticated, organized political act where enslaved people staked their claim to humanity and to liberty.
And it really forces us to rethink the origins of our own freedom and who gets to define it.
I want to thank you all for listening to this edition of the Mini Book Podcast, African American Books Edition. It's been quite a journey.
Truly.
Please, if you found this valuable, hit that subscribe button, tell a friend about the podcast. We really do rely on word of mouth. It helps so much.
And we want to hear from you. Please jump into the comments and let us know, what other books should we cover in future episodes? What part of African American history do you want to learn more about?
We love getting those suggestions. It really helps guide the show.
And one last reminder, go buy Calling Out Liberty by Jack Schuler. Support the author so he can keep doing this kind of important work.
Absolutely.
And I'd like to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We talked about the uncanny network, how the rebels communicated through drums and quilts and whispers. In our world today, we are hyper-connected. We have the internet, social media, everything. But are we communicating about the things that really matter? Are we using our networks to call out liberty, or are we just using them to make noise? Something to think about.
That is a great question for all of us.
Thank you for subscribing and listening. We'll see you next time.